All right, welcome everybody to Laravel Austin Meetup. Every second Tuesday of the month, right here. One of our speakers canceled, so it's all going to be Hunter today.
You're stuck with me, guys.
And if you were here last month, we started talking about API development, and this is part 2 of developing APIs.
Thank you, Terry. So, as you said, this is part 2 of the talk that I started last month. I'll provide a link to the last PowerPoint slides whenever I upload these online, so you can kind of follow along or have some sort of reference. But last time we met, we were on the topic of excuse me, endpoint planning, and really had just about one thing left to talk about, and that was controllers. Something that most of us should hopefully be familiar with using MVC frameworks like Laravel. So, before I get into this, when I started last month, the idea of the example app was to do something closely related to what I wanted to do with my personal site, but partly due to laziness of trying to actually figure out everything for this example, and the other part being I came up with a more interesting, better idea. So basically the app that we're going to build for this API is called SUPS, the new competitor to the hit app Yo, since apparently if you can make an app that just says Yo to your friends, why not make it an app where you can say Sup to your friends as well? Or any form of what's up or anything like that. So that's what we're going to build with this API. And one of the things that we need to basically list users and subs. Well, in REST, everything is a resource. All resources need controllers, so easy, users controller, subs controller. But some things in REST, while everything in REST is a resource, not every single resource needs to have a one-to-one relationship to having a controller or not. So some things within our app, like subs, are sub-resources of the user, or since this is going to be a mobile-specific app, we need to be able to register devices so that we can send them push notifications through parse or some sort of other library. And we don't really need a controller just for the devices, so we can probably move that to just a simple method on the user's controller. But these rules are pretty flexible, whichever you're more comfortable with. If you want to have a one-to-one relationship between the resource and the controller, that is up to you. But here's kind of an example of routes and the actions and how it would look. So we have our basic CRUD endpoints for users, /users or post, get users X for an individual one, updating an individual user or deleting it. We can list all the users. If we want to get all the devices or friends of the user, we can just call get on users X devices or friends. As you can see here, those don't really need a controller just for those actions, since the devices will only ever belong to a user. So we're just going to go ahead and stick it into a method on the user's controller. And same with friends, especially since friends are basically just user objects that are related to the user that you're currently looking at. As for the subs though, we may already have controller logic for other sub type actions. So we'll use, even though we're calling it as a sub resource, we can probably reuse some of that same logic that we already have in the subs controller to get for the specific user. Since Laravel is one of those nice packages that will tell us when we have a like URL variable, which is not the right way to say it, but I can't remember the correct way to say it. So basically, it'll tell us, hey, we've got this user ID floating around here, and you can change up the logic in this index method if need be. And this is just one of the ways that I like to lay out the the routes as well as the controllers. It keeps everything nice and concise, easy to understand for both yourself and any future developers that you might bring on board. And that's pretty much the last bit we had to finish up with endpoint planning. I just forgot to stick in the PowerPoint last time, which is the other reason why we didn't cover it. So, our next topic is input and output theory, aka requests and responses. The main way that you pretty much interact with the API. So, requests are pretty simple. Request is basically just an HTTP request to the API that can look something like this. I don't know if any of you have ever played around with actually writing requests to any sort of web service in this manner. I did recently, and it was one of those like, yay, why would I do this for college? But at the heart of it, this is pretty much what all requests to an API is going to look like. Getting the users, and we're saying, hey, latitude, longitude, or blank and blank, HTTP version 1.1. Sooner or later, there might be another version, who knows. And just the host that you're requesting. Posting to the API is pretty much the same thing. We have the addition of the authorizer header, which would probably be in the get users request as well. But this time you're telling the request of what the content type of the HTTP body is. In this case, JSON, and then the body itself. Basically just create a user with a first name Hunter. Pretty simple, just define your headers, define the body, make sure the format is correct, send it, done. You've already started talking to an API. On the flip side, we have responses. Much like the HTTP request, it's just going to line up as plain text. Unless we're using SSL, but let's not get carried away just yet. HTTP version 1.1, status code 200 OK, what the server is, and there can be a bunch of other headers, both standard with the request and custom ones that you can set. If you ever have X powered by in your PHP thing, make sure to go into your PHP INI and turn expose PHP to off, because no one needs to know that. But it's basically just saying, hey, the server is an Nginx, and here's the content type of the response. Once again, JSON. And we've got just the ID of the user we made and the first name. Obviously, I'm using one of those auto increment IDs that I said were bad, but I didn't feel like generating a UUID for the slide. And that's all an API pretty much is. It's just HTTP request and subsequently HTTP responses. So there's various formats that you can support when making a request. And one of the ones that I like to stick to is avoiding anything like application x www URL form encoded. The reason why is because a lot of times some PHP developers will like to associate the _get and _post globals to a get and a post request, and that's not the case. Because post can have everything that's also in get, and get is just all the query parameters. Post can have all the query parameters as well as the actual post body. As well as that, in URL form encoded, everything becomes a string. Like the example I have up there, foo equals something, bar equals 1, and baz equals 0. We can't have true or false because they just evaluate to the strings of true and false. And we have data types for reasons. Sure, we're pretty familiar with not having strict data types in PHP, but if they exist and we're responding with the data types, why just throw them away for ease of access reasons? That, and in Laravel, we have the input JSON foo function to get at that JSON data. And even just calling input get on a JSON request will return the value as well. And if you're not using Laravel and you're just using basic PHP, like file get contents PHP input will give you exactly everything you need from the JSON input. And then it's just a simple JSON decode, and you've got your fancy array with all your values from the request. This is really what I like, and I'll admit some of the APIs that I've worked on in the past don't mirror this exactly, but making a request like this with just sup, which user it's identified, and the type of the sup. In this case, scary movie. So as we all know, the what's up bullshit is what they get. This is a perfectly valid HTTP request. It makes documentation very, very easy on what a request to the endpoint would look like, as well as error generation, because then you can say, well, you sent a sup object to the user's endpoint. What did you think was going to happen? Like, idiot. Fix your shit and make it a user request to the user's endpoint. Excuse me. If we try to use that same request in form data, it looks something like this, which is this typing out in itself was a pain in the ass. And if you have things like arrays as part of the request, suddenly you can have like I don't know why I wrote check-in. Basically, you can have like, say, check-in user ID, and then array brackets equal 1, and then and that same block again for each and every single element in the array, and suddenly this massive form data request just turns into a massive mess of horribleness. And do not, for the love of God, mix JSON with form data, because I don't know who you're trying to impress with that crap near the bottom of the screen, but just know, why would you make anyone do this to work with your API? It's just not fun. Now as for JSON versus XML, as I've said before, prefer JSON over XML for the reason that on the left we have our typical JSON response. It's a sup object, we have an ID as an integer, we have strings, we have booleans, nulls, and empty strings. In XML, we start to lose some of that because it doesn't really support booleans, so we get back to the 0 or 1, and there's no concept of null or empty strings. So we lose the data type once again, and image and comment basically would just become the same type of variable. Now, if you're familiar with XML, you might ask, well, why don't you use attributes in your XML? Well, this XML is basically what would be auto-generated in the same fashion that, say, a JSON encode request we made. Doing data attributes in the XML isn't something native to the XML encoding within PHP. So you probably have to use something like, sticking with Laravel, making like a blade template with the XML structure for a sub and basically returning a view make for that XML, passing in the variable and sticking all the variables in everywhere, and it just becomes less intuitive. That, and between the JSON and XML responses, JSON responses are consistently smaller footprints network-wise than an XML response is. Excuse me. So, kind of just wrap that up. JSON, yay. XML, boo. But if you have to use it, then I'm sorry. If you've got, say, a lot of Ruby bros that are working with your API, then maybe you want to support YAML, since it's a pretty big, they're used to YAML, and it's pretty close to JSON, just less curly brackets and more space delimited. So those would be the two ones that I'd support, but mainly if everyone can use JSON, I'd just support one format at first, because while it'd be great to support input and output in lolcat, I don't think anybody has the time to build those parsers. So let's move on to the content structure of your responses. And to do that, we're going to look at what some of the big players do, and then I'll show you all one of the structure that I personally like and prefer. So first up is Twitter. Very minimalistic. If you want an item, you just get back a JSON item with its attributes. And if you want a collection, you get the array of the multiple items. Short, simple, pros of it, minimalistic. Pretty much every framework can understand it. The downside is, though, there's no space in the namespace to add metadata or pagination data into, say, the collection request, because the second you try and do that with JSON, you can't switch between, well, in PHP you can switch between arrays having numbered keys, and then sometimes like an associative array, you can go like 0, 1 animals, 2, 3, blah, blah, etc., etc. When you do that in JSON, it's gonna turn this guy in the collection to this nice format, to then having like a 0 that does nothing with the actual collection necessary underneath it, and then meta, and it just starts making the namespacing of the response pretty annoying to work with. Facebook, on the other hand, same thing as Twitter. You want an item, here's your item back. You want a collection, they namespace that collection under data, which is great because it's still pretty simplistic, and at least for the collections, you can now have the namespace for a meta attribute that can then have your pagination data and whatever else will be needed for it. But on the negative side, there's no way to get metadata for the single item without embedding it within the resource. So, kind of a combination of something more or less what Facebook used and some tweaks to it is my preference, which is just simplistically, you want an item, namespace under data is the item. You want the collection, namespace under data, you've got the collection. Leaves namespace for meta attributes or anything of the sorts, and it's pretty easy to understand. And what's nice about this is that if you embed resources, say we've got our users and we want to embed the subs, under subs would be yet another data attribute. So then in the embedded resource, we can keep namespacing any sort of pagination data or anything of the sorts. And we can just keep following that down through every single embed for as much as we want to embed. This is also kind of how, if you're familiar with the package Fractal from the PHP League, this is the, for a while it was the only way to return data, which may or may not kind of swayed my preference towards it, but even now that Fractal has the different serializers, I prefer to stick to it because it's pretty easy to follow. It's just, I need my data under the data key. Obviously, you'll want to tweak your responses depending on your use cases. Say if you're working with Ember data and you have the power to change how your API responds. Ember data is one of those things that's very, very opinionated on how the JSON needs to look, which is more or less by the JSON-API.org standards. From personal experience of trying to hack Ember data to work with this type of response, I would just change the serializer to match what Ember data is looking for. But whatever works for your team and the people that are consuming your API, be it just internal mobile developers or public API for everyone, is what I would stick to. Obviously, as I always like to say, just keep it as consistent as possible. So, from there, let's transition into status codes, errors, and messages, oh my.
I have a question for, isn't there a specific style the collection has to be for to transfer the JSON over to Objective-C dictionary object? And it's square bracket, curly bracket, so the opposite of what you just showed there. So the collection starts with a square bracket, and then you'll have the data, your...
It's an array of hashes.
So
Right.
The dictionary starts with a square bracket.
Yeah, if that is the case, it hasn't presented a problem, because this is how our API kicks back, and my iOS developer hasn't complained. But because I think what's happening is, whenever the JSON is coming back, technically at the root level, this is just a JSON object that has a data key with the collection as its value. So
so he's setting up the parser to consume it however he wants.
Yeah, if I'm correct, he's probably, or at least how I would do it is have the parser just target that data attribute. So, hey, I'm looking for this collection. It's always going to be on their data or
Yeah,
the
so I was
resource.
just thinking of the parser in the Objective-C library, which you can do whatever you want. You
Right.
don't have to use it, so.
And then there's REST kits and all those other
Yeah.
lovely tools for iOS. I'm unfortunately not too familiar with the iOS consumption side of APIs. I'd like to get into it if I have time, which is always the big.
Which is important because you don't have to do it. It'd be nice to just do it once, because I know that Java can handle JSON how it wants.
Right. Yeah. I will say that with Android, this switching between with data being a object for single and array for collections. I know my Android developers have kind of griped a little bit about that one with building their models to interface with, I can't remember the library off the top of my head for like doing Android apps, but I haven't heard exactly what the complaint was, and they figured out how to get around it, so I never looked
Just
too
build
much
their own
further.
parser.
Possibly. They either built their own parser or some way, somehow.
I was curious if you had any insight on it, if it really mattered, or I think it's just, if you know what the parser can handle and you can standardize it for both parsers, but I don't think that's the case anyways.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I wouldn't know, but I know that with this type of response structure for the own API that I've been developing for Basanti, both Android and iOS can parse it, as well as Ember with some hacking. But yeah, thanks for the nice question. I actually hadn't thought about that in quite a while. But yeah, back on track. Status codes, errors, and messages. Oh my. With HTTP status codes, just kind of a rundown for anybody who's not terribly familiar with them is the range is basically anything in the 200s is just all forms of success. And that can be either just 200 okay, you got the response resource back, 201, you create something okay, or 202, your request was good, but the process is being handled async, and we'll get back. Something could mess up in the async, but the request to start the async process was okay. Anything in the 300 direction is pretty much all forms of redirect. 400 is forms of client errors, so something like the client made a bad request, either a bad HTTP request, or you can use it for validation. Say, hey, you sent back an incorrectly formatted email. When you kick back that error, you use something in the 400, probably like 410. And then 500 is pretty much your API did something incorrectly, it's borked. Oops. Here's a couple of example codes to use. I would try to keep the status codes that you use down to a minimum because there's really no achievement you're going to get for using as many of them as possible. And the more of them you use, the more of them you have to try and document and keep somewhere going, okay, this means that, that means this. So 201 created okay, 202 accepted for processing async, 400 is a bad request. Excuse me. Technically, 400 bad request means that the HTTP request was bad or syntaxed badly, but a lot of people use this for validation errors. 401 and 403 are unauthorized and forbidden. 404 we're hopefully all familiar with. 410 is the data was deactivated, deleted, or something. So say you have a API that supports like soft deleting of things or can know that something was there but is deleted and someone requested, you can kick back a 410 instead of a 404. And then 500, the API screwed up. 503, the API is unavailable. Please leave a message after the beep. These are some pretty good list of ones to use. If you're doing things like OAuth2 and using a package to handle OAuth2, which I suggest you do so instead of rolling your own, it'll kick back the 401 and 403. errors. Laravel has a lot of built-in 4.0, like throwing to the 404, and the one that I actually haven't used but would like to get to using is 410. I'm kind of doing this something that I'll hit on in just a moment, which is using 404 a little too much for, excuse me, everything, be it doesn't exist or doesn't exist anymore. But yeah. As for error codes and messages, what's nice about error codes and subsequently the messages that will usually come along with them is that it'll help explain to the developer working with your API what happened if the request failed. The error codes are helpful because you can give like a short message in the actual response, have the error code with well-known documentation link, whatever, and they can go to that documentation part of your site and go, okay, Control F, paste the code. Okay, so that's what happened. I don't know how to send emails correctly, and move on. You can, depending on the size of the API, use just the HTTP status codes exclusively instead of making your own error codes, but more times than not it doesn't work because it's always possible you have multiple errors that all belong to the same status code. So it'd be easier to just document the error codes instead of saying, okay, if you get a 400, it could be reasons A through Z plus more that screwed up. Excuse me. So the status codes are really more or less just hints. Like, oh, I got a 400. I made a bad request. What's going on? Look at the response, see the error code or the message, and respond accordingly. And some people might even say, okay, this happened. They'll kick back their own message. Or if you have a pretty good message in the error response that explains what happened, the developer can just take your error message and present it to the user, and everything's good to go. This is one that I was kind of iffy about talking about in this presentation, which is error or errors. Basically, what I mean by this is that Laravel actually kind of helps doing this one way and say, you're creating a user and you have a bunch of validation rules, and if you're using the built-in validator, you can just check if it fails. And if it failed one or multiple fields for the input, you can just kick back the whole errors array from the validator. When I was doing like research and reading up from Phil Sturgeon's book, it's one way or the other. Some people prefer only giving back a single error. So you could have the first name, last name, and email fields wrong in your request, but you wouldn't know that all three are wrong because you'd hit the API, go down the field list, this email's wrong. Stops there, errors out. You fix the email, make the request again, hit the first name, stop there, error out, etc., until the request is good. I more or less kind of hate when it does that because I hate having to like trial and error make the same request like over and over and over again to figure out everything, if anything, that could be wrong with a request. So I like to stick with the sending back all possible errors with a request at once, basically, because I use the built-in validator library. Since the messages are pretty helpful that Laravel comes with, and you're perfectly, like, you can change the messages to not the default that comes with Laravel. So this is one of those things where it's up to you. If you want to try and keep your controller in as stable a state as possible always, and want to just error out the first time it hits an error, then by all means do so. But if you want to just kick back everything that's wrong with the data after validation, nothing's wrong with that too. So a couple of common pitfalls when doing like error codes and status codes is returning a 200 okay, but something being wrong. Do not do this. This is bad. Seriously, might have to smack you. And if you read build APIs you don't hate, I didn't want to spoil this joke, but Sturgeon's got a pretty good explanation of what might happen to you if you use 200 OK and error codes. It's pretty misleading because if something errored, you'd expect a error status code, not a, oh hey, the request was okay. But wait, what do you mean there was an error? The status code says it's okay, but why don't you just tell me it's not okay with the status code? So then I can look into the response to see what actually is wrong. 404 abuse. I'm guilty of this myself, but a lot of times developers will use 404 for this never existed, you can't view this, it no longer existed, etc., and it's a bit too vague. So you can use the status codes such as 403 and 410 to help. So 403, forbidden, you can't view this, you're in the wrong group or don't have permission to it. 404, hey, that never existed, what are you trying to find? And 410 to, hey, this was deactivated, deleted, unpublished, etc. You can kind of see there with 410 that it can still be a bit vague, and even with 403 just saying forbidden. Why? Why is it forbidden? 410 no longer exists. Well, why does it no longer exist? So this is where you can complement these status codes with the error codes to explain exactly what happened. Be it, okay, this resource was deactivated, or this resource, you can't view this resource because you don't belong to the group blank, etc. So using the status codes along with making your own error codes, while will take some time, will help developers that wind up using your API to figure out exactly what went wrong. So if it's an internal API and you have all these error codes documented, you have less of messages on HipChat or Slack or an email going, hey, so I'm getting this error from, why am I getting this error from the API? And you're sitting there like, leave me alone, I've got work to do, stop emailing me about all these why doesn't it work requests. If it's all documented, they just go, why is it not working? Oh, okay, I screwed up. You don't have to deal with as many annoyances, you can keep working on making the API better, and everyone's happy. So, with that, let's go into questions, concerns, complaints, praise. What's up?
If you're not using soft deletes in your database, then how could you use like a 410 or something? I mean, I think you're kind of stuck with 404.
Yeah, in that case, the 410 really comes into play if you're running a service that has the concept of like soft deletes or resources being deactivated or unpublished. But if you're just straight up deleting the data, then there's nothing really wrong with the 404 because it technically does not exist anymore at all. So that's one of the things that I thought about when I was writing this. And yeah, unless you do some very convoluted thing of storing like a list somewhere of all things deleted and looking up every time something's requested in that list to see if it was deleted, just saying that sounded annoying, so implementing it would probably be even more annoying. So 404 would be probably okay.
Do you implement any sort of throttling for your day job? I mean,
for us, we're not really doing any like request throttling. We have the power to since we're using that Dingo package I talked about 2 months ago, and the throttling is something that I'm going to hit on soon. But yeah, I can't remember the status code. I get kicked back when you hit the throttle limit. I believe it's actually in the 400 range, probably 403 for that instance. But
similarly, do you track analytics on your API usage and how do you do that?
At the moment, not really. It's actually something that I've been thinking about on how to do without slowing down the API to capture either the request. I mean, if I was gonna do any like analytic tracking, I'd probably start looking at just like request coming in and seeing like most requested and things like that. But at the moment, I haven't thought hard enough to actually implement it. So the only analytics that are really running comes from the application monitoring from New Relic. So I can see the like most popular transactions through New Relic, but I can't see anything like that would, yeah, like I can't see anything like that Basanti would actually want to look at.
I missed the first half of all this thing, but I was wondering, like, for an API, like a lot of times they have to OAuth or whatever, and I've never like implemented that with an API. It's like, is that hard? I mean,
there are some very great packages that assist in that. The PHP League, which has a lot of very well done packages, has a OAuth 2 server package that you just install with Composer. It's documented on how to set it up to actually like give out the access tokens basically. I mean, it comes with all the SQL commands you need to run to actually generate the tables in a database, and there's actually another package that is just a Laravel specific wrapper around all of it. So it gives you the fancy providers and the facets to interact with the API, or excuse me, with the OAuth server, and then you just basically you have to do some monkeying around with setting up your own scopes and plugging in the logic to say like what scope and what owner type can access different resources. So I would definitely never recommend rolling your own because there's a lot of things you have to meet for that spec and it's not easy. So might as well use one that's very well tested from the PHP League.
Mhm.
But
I think the Carlist folks make a lot of API.
I believe, yeah, I think Carlos does have one too. I haven't used the Carlos one though. The main one that I've used is the PHP Leagues. And if you use the Dingo API package I talked about like 2 months ago, that makes a lot of this API development pretty simplified and streamlined. It, for all intents and purposes, basically sets up the OAuth for any type of authentication stuff along with the throttling for you. You just have to change a certain config value for the package to tell it, hey, use this OAuth server for authentication, and then make your request to the give me a token endpoint using whatever grant type you want. Get back the tokens, slap it in the authorization header, and you're on your way. When I do plan on talking about the authorization stuff soon, and I promise soon these talks will actually involve some coding live. Kind of just preparing myself mentally for that. So we will actually walk through setting up the OAuth stuff. I'm still debating if I want to, right out of the bat, use the Dingo API package. The only reason why I wouldn't is because it kind of takes away some of the like tedium of doing the OAuth setup stuff yourself that we went through, but at the same time, I think, well, if the package exists to remove that tedium and there's nothing stopping you from using it, why not use it? So soon we will actually walk through building this API and we'll go over the OAuth stuff then as well. And you're always free to email me or find me and ask questions as you're going along. I'll try to answer to the best of my ability. Anybody else got anything? I technically have a bit set up to where you can at least go through setting up the API routes, but I'm not sure if anybody wants to watch route building. I feel like most of us are pretty familiar with Laravel to at least set up routes and controllers in the framework, but
There's some people that might be newer or just interested.
okay. Would y'all want to at least see some of that walkthrough? I mean, we've got time, so.
So this API that you have built, there's an iPhone app and an Android app to talk to it, and it's one thing I was wondering. I've never made a mobile app, but like, so you do. You're not storing. Obviously, you're not storing these. These users have to be in a database somewhere on the internet. So
Yeah, that's kind of what got me into making our API development in the first place, because as the company started and we were figuring everything out, I was like, how do you get database data into mobile apps? Because there's no like MySQL connections, and that would probably be super slow on 3G or even LTE networks. And that line of research took me into APIs and using that to get the data out of the database to Android, iPhone, Windows, BlackBerry phones. So from there, I kind of started making it, and well, I latched onto it and found it to be quite fun, and here I am today giving a talk about APIs. So let me get PHP Storm launched and over to the AirPlay screens, and hopefully they're not too laggy. I've noticed with Yosemite at the moment, AirPlay can be a bit jittery, so hopefully that doesn't affect us too much. Come on. Hopefully by the end of this, we will build the API for the obviously going to be very successful competitor to Yo, which I still can't understand how such an app is making a lot of money at the moment, but if it works, it works.
Did I say making money, or is it just got an investor?
Well, it's got an investor, which is basically, I think, from what I heard, it got at least a couple million investors, which is pretty dang good. I don't think they'll have to worry about paychecks for a while. Alright, is that big enough for everybody to read, or would y'all like the font a little bit bigger?
A lot bigger.
Okay. I can do a lot bigger. Better? Okay. So, okay. Oh, there we go. Now it's better. So, I'm just gonna real quick create a just very simple user's controller. this story because English is easy or something. Okay, so now that we've got our controller, while Laravel does have some fancy like route magic, I personally would like to, I try to stay away from using, these magic methods when doing the route generation for an API, just because this routes file more or less reads just like a documentation file for, say, a new developer to understand all of the available endpoints. So if you see something around get, post, put, delete, options, etc., you understand what you can do with those endpoints. But if you hide something behind, say, this, we're going to see if I actually remember how to do that correctly. One. We'll come back to that. Well, thanks. Basically, what this route resource does is it expects there to be a resource controller to have the following methods that I created: the index, show, store, update, and destroy, and it'll automatically create the routes for get, post, put, delete, for the listing, creating of a user, updating, destroying a user, as well as the showing an individual user. So that basically just turns those 5 possible routes into one nice method. But if the new developer, say, isn't too familiar with Laravel, then he might look at route resource and just, he or she might look at it and be like, what is that? What does that mean? So, as you can see here, I actually did manage to write that syntax correctly. So, we automatically get the routes that.
So I didn't see if you implemented an interface for that, but that sounded like it should have been an interface that you implemented. That's all the functions that are required for that controller. For the route controller.
You can do that just to make your life easier, so that instead of having to write them over and over again, you can just have an interface that always brings in those methods for the resource. But excuse me. Only reason I don't do that is because, well, I stick to index, store, update, show, and destroy. You don't have to go with those names. You could make the method names list, one, create.
All right, then they're not strict.
Yeah, they're not. It's not strict. If you go for the resource route, then yes, you have to. But if you use the just built-in,
I'm talking about your controller. Can you go back to users controller number, please? Okay, your base controller. Never mind. I thought so. Your base controller isn't an interface. It's just a.
yeah, it's. This is where I put various helper methods to, excuse me, say return the response correctly. So instead of having to write the same response returning over and over and over again, I can write methods for return item, return collection. If it's an error, I can just have methods that automatically return the correct error with status code and everything. I can put them on the base controller, and then from there, every resource controller afterwards can just inherit those methods. And then you just build the methods for whatever you need. So following that the example I had in this slideshow, if I can type. And that is our method for the sub-resource of the user's devices. And just as simply, there's the method to get all the users' friends. The downside to using Another downside of using resource is you'll have this resource call, and then to interface with those sub-resource methods, you'll have to wind up writing these manual route declarations anyway. So you're going to have to do users ID friends to then get to the users friends and subsequently their devices. So if you're going to have to use these anyway for the sub-resources, I say why not just keep it consistent, because consistency is something I quite enjoy, and just declare them all in the same manner.
All your actions.
Every action that you can do for every single resource, you'll have to declare in this manner. It will take a bit of time, but I would much rather spend the time doing this instead of having to explain to a new developer that, oh yeah, that resource thing is just a magic method. You'll have to read the documentation to understand, and it just works. And it removed like 5 lines for us, so that I could then explain this to you that it removed 5 lines. I used to use resource all the time because I was being a bit lazy, but the more and more I did this.
I think a service manager would be so easy, so much easier to designate a service manager and just have an open action.
You can, I believe, do. If I'm correct, that is a possible call in the route is route any. I haven't ever used it, so I have no idea how to even hook that up. But you could technically just eat any and all types of requests to a certain endpoint to handle it the same way. But once you do this, I don't have it set up to actually test and show you in something like Postman to make the curl calls, but just returning those strings that I had in the controllers, you basically have an API just from this right here. This is all it takes to get an API, or your first resources actually available on the API. Obviously, there's not returning much because we're just kicking back strings with just random crap. But right here, just like that example in one of the slides, we have all the possible interactions with the user resource, either getting a list of them, an individual, creating, updating, deleting, as well as getting its friends and devices. And then we could add onto this even further and have route get users ID subs pointing to the subs controller and process it that way. The only way I'm not at the moment is because the AirPlay connection is lagging the crap on our machine and I think you'll understand the process of making a controller. So, yeah.
Another thing with the resource is that, and I just tested it, is that it will create, if you do check the routes, it creates routes automatically for everything it expects. So you don't even have to have any of that stuff in there. You can have a completely blank user's controller and it'll still show up as a route.
Yep.
So you just do the resources, it automatically generates the action?
Yeah, well, and some resources may only have, you know, show endpoint or get endpoint. So then, but if you were to look at the routes that Laravel's creating in the back end, it's going to still have every single one of them.
And on top of it, it creates, you'll see on there that there's the get or head users create or get or head users edit. If you use the resource route, you're always going to get those 2 extra just do nothing routes because it's kind of generating the controller, the resource controller for a like web application. So it's basically going like, all right, you have an index to show like all the users, and then at create is basically where you'd render the page to create the user, with at store being the route that page hits with the form data. Same with edit and update. It's just edits the page that would you would show to edit a user, and then update is where the form would put to in this case. And you're always going to have those routes. And if someone ever accidentally hits them and you don't handle it, it's 1, going to possibly throw an API error, and 2, if you go this route, then you've got to do extra work to basically prevent those routes from ever doing anything, either throwing a 405 method not allowed yourself, or a 404 route not found, even though it technically is. So while the resource thing kind of lessens the amount of work you have to spend typing out every single route, it adds work because then it generates extra available routes that you have to prevent the users from hitting.
Well, if you don't implement the method, I think I saw when I used it one time, if you don't implement the method for create, it just dies as method not allowed.
So okay, then
It was like, or it may have been a coincidence, like I was hitting one of the routes that it just was the wrong type, the wrong HTTP request type.
right.
But yeah, it just threw a 405 or whatever it is, or
Okay.
yeah, method not allowed. I think that's what it was. Yeah, so you don't necessarily have to die, but it is interesting to your question. Like if you use that thing, Laravel should make that, generate that class, should enforce that, implements an interface that all the methods are there. Otherwise, yeah, it is kind of wonky. You get 405, and like, why is this number 405? Why am I hitting this at all?
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
I've actually played around with creating just an interface so that instead of having to write all those functions myself, I can just implement the interface, import all the use PHP storm to implement the methods off the interface, and yay, I have less typing, and then I at least know contractually that controller is going to have those methods. But I more or less use the interfaces more with repositories than with the controllers themselves.
Are those calls you have your input validation built in? Do you have any kind of built-in? All those, the ID, they take, you know, if they take a number, if it's alphanumeric. You actually built those into your functions.
No, you can do it on the routes. You just didn't do it, but you can do it on the routes. Yeah, you can enforce what type of stuff gets put in the URL.
Yeah, you can enforce it with. I haven't actually done this in a while.
Just a third call.
Yeah, I think you can do.
Yeah, I was just curious. You don't have to do it.
Yeah,
I don't know. What's? I
It's
haven't
just
tried
a
that.
regex.
yeah, it's basically just a regex thing.
It's a where, and then you put.
Oh, that's right. It works. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, you are right. I felt like it was an additional method call on it, but you can enforce
I
it.
believe it is a chain on it, but I think it is where or something like that.
Right. So you can either, if you're using the just numeric IDs or the auto increment IDs from the database, then if you want to make sure they don't send a string, you can just either force it in the route itself with the regex call, or you can handle that on in the actual either controller function or the repository that is actually retrieving that, we'll say user, and either just do user find or fail and catch that exception from there and kick back the correct.
So I heard you say that auto-incrementing ID is bad. Why is that?
Because if you use auto-incrementing IDs, then it makes people that expect scrape APIs to basically just like steal your data. It's a job a lot easier, because then they just have to build a script that just goes for range of 1 to whatever, just call the get, say, user at that ID.
They just have to loop through a bunch of.
And they just have to loop through a bunch of numbers to get it.
But they have to be authenticated if they're doing. If you have like a.
Oh yeah,
It's not a public API.
if it's not a public, you can obviously catch it if you're logging like request and seeing like all of a sudden that one auth token requested every single user in the span of like 5 seconds. You can immediately go, hey, wait a minute, stop doing that, and revoke the auth token. But if you don't even use the auto-increment IDs in the first place, then it's one less thing you have to worry about.
That's a good idea, though. I think it would be better just to limit the rate of requests. Like,
you can throttle as well, but you can, if depending on how dedicated that scraper is, and if it knows, most times when you do throttling, you kick back in the header how many more requests you can do in what time frame. If they build the scraper intelligently enough, then they can just inspect that header each time to know, all right, I'm close to my throttle, I've got to wait this amount of time,
True.
wait, sleep, okay, let's go again. And keep
So,
scraping.
I mean, what is the alternative? Because I feel like if you don't use auto-incrementing, doesn't that affect the DB performance? Isn't that like why people use auto-incrementers?
You can use the auto-increment IDs behind the scenes. What you do is you just add an extra UUID is what I like to use, so that then instead of getting users 1, you're getting users long or short, whatever type of UUID you use. So that then instead of, sure, you'll lose the ability to use like eloquent models like find, and you have to just do user where UUID is the ID, but that way all the relations and everything can be maintained using the auto-increment IDs on the database, and to the outside world, user 1 is just user big ass UUID.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They can still technically loop through and scrape everything by using the list endpoint in tandem with the get endpoint, but it's going to go a lot slower because now they're having to do multiple requests to get all the possible UUIDs to then loop through again to get all the data, and it'll take a lot longer and give you a bigger time span to actually notice, hey, wait a minute, that request activity is looking a bit suspicious. Deactivate, send you were doing something suspicious looking. If you weren't, sorry. If you were, stop it and move on from there.
Find a way if they want it that bad. As long as it's not like bank records. Who cares?
Yeah, the reason why is you do, like, it's a good thing to try and stop it, but obviously, as a lot of us know, that if someone's bound and determined to get at your data, then they'll spend every waking moment they can to try and get to it, and there's only so much you can do to stop it, but this is just one of the ways to at least prevent scrapers from
that is a good idea.
getting into it.
It seems more secure. I always feel weird when I have like the actual IDs in the URL all the time.
Yeah, I used to do the actual ID and the URL as well, and I'll admit, even I, for a while, thought, it seems kind of weird, and finally just forced myself to take the effort of just adding the one extra column to the database, and there's a lot of very well done UUID generation libraries for PHP, though you can either generate like actual UUIDs, or you can generate more YouTube-esque type IDs that you use for the videos to use in place of just your normal auto-increment IDs. So one of those just pick your poison type of things.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I will, if anybody has any other questions.
I was giving a suggestion. One of the things that we do rather. So most of our APIs are for internal consumption. We don't do public stuff, so it's for our own admin tools and facing things. But what we actually do is, like you said, for the data and being able to namespace it, it allows you to namespace other things. And we have 2 other properties that we put in our general response view.
Yeah.
JSON response is like we put an errors node and a debug node. And what we do is, if you're in the dev environment and the debug is like if something's going to actually throw an error, not just a happy response, we actually pipe the stack trace in there.
Oh, nice.
So that if you're behind the dev, you can actually see what actually happened, what really happened. And also the errors thing, so we actually put in the straight, like you said to put an error code, we actually put the verbiage version of it so that somebody can actually look in the console and go and look at the JSON response.
Oh yeah.
And actually kind of read it out a little bit. So when you mentioned about error codes, you didn't really mention like or your own internal codes, how you guys implement that.
Yeah, for ours, we do the, don't crash. We do the errors thing as well. We have, basically whenever an error happens, you'll get back a message key with some sort of thing. At the moment, for our errors, I'm kind of failing to practice when I'm preaching with the error codes, just because I haven't had time to make the error codes, unfortunately. But we do message, what happened, and then errors, and it's just an array of, say if it's a validation error, it'll be...
Yeah, validation if they're, yeah.
Yeah, and the debug thing is actually something that I'm interested in now.
Can you believe how helpful it is?
'Cause
Especially if you get a production error, and it's like, oh, can we reproduce that back in dev? Sure, we do it. We get page reacts badly, and we look in the debug node, and it tells us exactly,
Is that Laravel?
No, we don't do that. Yeah.
I was gonna say, well, for Symfony,
But
I
you
understood-
should be able to orchestrate that.
When I get an error, when I get an API error or whatever for Symfony, I hit preview. It'll actually, if I'm in dev, it'll actually show me like a web page that has the stack trace and all that, which I didn't do any of that. I just noticed that one day and I was like, wow, now I use it all the time. I'm wondering if Laravel has that. Like, if you have an error, like, if you just hit preview, maybe it'll show you like what you would see if you were to actually like go to that view. Could you go to that view? Like,
Yeah, I think Laravel has that, what is it, the whoops error handler?
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It uses that too, so.
I turned that off actually. What I did is I registered I modified I think Laravel has an error handler
Yeah, it does.
callback. I actually modify that callback to not use that error handler because it spits out HTML back to the client. And I don't want that happening because an app trying to expecting a JSON request getting HTML back usually is not a good thing.
Right.
So what I do is I just override the built-in error handler in Laravel, and I log everything to a log file and send back like a nice pretty 500 JSON response. That's the way I handle it at least.
Yeah, if you, in the configs, if you turn debug on the main app one to false, it'll automatically stop using that whoops thing.
Yeah.
So on production we use that, and then besides one error that I think we tracked down finally that was not throwing a JSON error, it was just throwing a plain text one. I think Terry knows the one I'm talking about. So that was fun, but since we started using the Dingo package, what's nice is that for all the I can just throw exceptions from the repository and it'll automatically capture it and kick back the correct error. And then, excuse me. As for 500, I just have in the general app error catch for just all exceptions to just kick back a general response of something went wrong, and then that's at the moment.
Are you throwing so my application, I have different exception types. So I have like an invalid access token exception, I have a validation error exception.
Right.
And then in that exception, I override the code so that when I throw the error, my generic error handler can actually just look at the code that's in, it'll use get code to get the code and then throw that back out to the client. I don't know, how are you handling that? Do you just you said you're just kind of throwing 500s right now
for most
everything?
any service error, I'm just throwing a 500 with a not too helpful message, just because it's an internal API at the moment, and more or less I've nailed down most generally the only time I see that 500 nowadays, thankfully, is when I throw the error myself in dev. But what's it called? Everything else changing it soon, but I'll just throw a certain type of exception that comes with Dingo for the different types of things like validations and all that, and then it'll automatically capture the exception and kick back the correct JSON for that error with the message from the exception as well as in the event of validation. I just pass in the validator's errors array, and it automatically shoves it into the response to kick back. And then the OAuth libraries handle their own exception responses for invalid tokens or forbidden and things like that.
When you do error responses and it's a validation error, are you sending back like an array of validation errors?
Pretty much of just this field, here's what's wrong with it. That field didn't do that correctly, etc., etc. And then the message is usually something generic like could not create user, could not update user, something like that. It's not the most in-depth message at the moment. Definitely room for improvement, but at the moment, it's been working.
Sometimes I just alert there was an error.
Yeah. Something went wrong.
Yeah.
Great. What went wrong?
Yeah, one thing I've been
That's why the
trying
stack,
to...
yeah, if you throw a little stack trace, have a little stack trace in there.
Yeah, honestly, I think the reason I've never thought about that is when I'm working in dev, usually if something errors out, I'll just xdebug, step through and figure out what happened, or just look at the Laravel log file, but it'd be nice to have that debug key to not have to go look at that log file.
We're using these are single page web apps, so it's sort of like complicated JavaScript, so by the time you actually get to the actual request that's done, there's off stuff that's happened, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, to try to just hit the service directly, you can sign in and hit it directly, but you're not going to simulate exactly what it posted with it.
Oh, yeah.
Under the error.
Well, I was going to show you an example response from the API work, but unfortunately, when I disabled AirPlay to hide my access token request with one of my personal passwords in for our staging environment, completely locked up the air display thing, so I can't get it to reconnect. So, fortunately, I won't be able to show you. But Terry's got something to show off, so I will bounce it off to Terry.
I can show you here's an error I'm getting.
Oh, sweet. It looks like JSON.
What is this app, or is this just a website?
It's one of Chrome's apps. You can either have it as part of a built into Chrome, running in one of the tabs, or one of their packaged apps. Just by the name of Postman. Really nice.
Oh, it reports your errors to a web interface or whatever, so you can
You
You make your REST calls up at the top.
You can do everything.
Yeah.
You can set up any header you want. You can talk to any service.
Yeah, so it's got all your
with the types and set any header you want.
headers,
Yeah.
and then you can.
What's nice is that you can set up. I haven't used these yet. I really want to get. I haven't had time to look into how to use it. But Postman has this concept of collections, which is basically just like a collection of multiple requests, and it has an extension that you can purchase to run tests on those collections. So basically, you can test your API by building up a collection of requests back to back to back, and just tell the test, hey, this should do that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Just hit that button and then sit back and watch all the requests flow through and all the responses kick back, which is
As an integrator,
sounds awesome.
PHP, you can get PHP in it to fire that off, or do you have to? How do you?
It's
you
just
fire that in as an automated test, or do you just?
it's a manual run test, not an automated,
But
but
it should be automatable at some point. I mean, if it's running in a browser,
yeah,
it's automatable.
it'll sooner or later. I'm sure someone will figure out an automated way. One of the things when I started working on the development side of actually building this API is I'm going to show one of the ways that I like to test. Excuse me. You can use something like bhat to test, which is basically the same version of how I believe the collections and the tests and collections run in Postman. But you can use bhat behavioral type test to basically say, when I request this with this type of response, I expect to get this back and then have the following properties, et cetera, down that line. It'll be a bit easier to understand when I actually have code to show you, but if you're interested, I would just Google search for bhat PHP. Should be the first GitHub result that shows up on Google.
Is that where they're writing Gherkin?
Yeah, it's
I
Gherkin
love that.
based.
It's so cool.
It's very nice.
When someone sends me like a feature or whatever that needs built out, I'm like, I don't know, a lot of times like I get crappy, like you get a PDF or whatever of like, dude, you know, when you click this, it does that. I always write it all out in Gherkin after that, and then it just makes, I figure like 10 things out that they didn't tell me before I'm done writing it, and I just, and then I'm like, okay, well, what about this, what about this, what about this? So when you start on it, like you already have like a lot more information than what you would have. And then you also have the Gherkin.
Yeah, it's a very powerful tool that I love using, and there's ways to make PHP unique do basically the same thing as well with Laravel, which is something else that we'll get into when we start. The plan for writing this API is soon I'm going to actually put this repo. I made the Git repo. I need to actually publish it, and I'll share the link so you can actually follow along the code through, and I'll just tag it for each meetup. But the idea of developing this is I'm basically going to write the database seeders and all that crap outside of the meeting, because I went over that last month and it's kind of just tedious and not fun to watch being written during this. But basically I'm going to actually get those controller endpoints to do something besides just return strings. And the next step of developing is, before actually having a fully functioning API, we're going to start by writing the test against it. We're going to follow test-driven development, build the test first, get all the lovely red saying, Jesus Christ, everything's wrong, and then we're going to start making progress to getting those tests to pass. And hopefully by the end of it, we'll have a nice functioning API for a service that no one's ever going to use. But hopefully at least will help y'all learn what's going on. And yeah, as Terry showed, here's kind of how our errors return from our API. Excuse me. And what's this?
All right, quick thing, this Thursday, the Austin PHP, which is all PHP meetup, they're having a special meetup. And it's a little bit Laravel related, because this guy, Paul Jones, he works on the Aura framework, and there's an Aura framework package, but then he's got a bunch of individual packages that are essentially like the Laravel packages, but he doesn't switch them all together. And but he really got onto Taylor Otwell for calling the things that he uses with the static method
Facades.
He got onto him for calling them facades, because there is a facade pattern that isn't exactly the same as what he was doing, and he's doing more of a service locator pattern, whatever. Anyways, so that guy really got on him, and he has a lot of had bad things to say about Laravel, but he's a smart guy. I mean, I've heard him on some podcasts and stuff. And then Brandon Savage, he's a pretty big guy in the PHP world. They're going to be speaking free here at this Region 13, Springdale Road.
The usual place.
Yeah, the usual. Yeah. So if y'all have never been to an Austin PHP meetup, this would be a great one to start with. These guys are both smart dudes that know what they're talking about. That's it. Next August 12th, back here.
God, it's already getting close to August.
Yeah.
Jesus.
We haven't hit the century mark yet.
I don't know if Logan, because last month they actually talked about that micro framework, so if you don't know anything about it. Last month they did a meet up and talked about Aura and Falcon. I don't know if it's on the Austin PHP whatever the website is.
It's Austin Tech Videos.
Austin videos, yeah.
Yeah,
Is it
search
up
for
there
that.
yet?
Nope.
Is last month's video up there yet?
I don't know. Sometimes it takes them a while, but
Yeah.
it may be up there.
Does anybody here know Symphony and Angular that's looking for a job?
Then it's closed.
No, what
Those
is
guys are like
Angular?
unicorns, I
You mean-
think.
I know they're totally different, but if you,
Yeah.
because you know Symphony
Like
and
that's a dude, so,
some Angular.
or Angular and something. What
Uh,
are you guys with?
I work for Surprise Highway, it's in Chicago, so it's a remote job, we're just looking for one more developer.
One thing, at least before you go, I'm gonna upload these slides. I'll post the link to the upload on the Meetup page once they're up there. My Twitter handle's at the beginning of the slide. If you have any questions about API stuff, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. And
If you want a faster response, IRC.
yeah, if you want an even faster response, join the Austin PHP IRC channel, and I'm pretty much always on there. Just ask away, and I'll be glad to help to the best of my ability. And yeah, thanks for listening.